She had never read aloud before. Not once. Not to her sisters, who would have laughed. Not to the servants, who would have reported it. Not to her father, who had decided when she was 12 years old that she could not read, and who had repeated it so many times and with such unwavering conviction that even Margaret herself, in her darkest and most exhausted moments, sometimes wondered if he was right, if the words she consumed in secret every night, the Latin and the French and the political economy and the poetry, if all of it was somehow different from real reading, lesser, counterfeit, the way a coin that hasn't been minted by the proper authority is still round and still shines, but isn't, technically, money. She had never read aloud, and now a duke was sitting across from her in a library that contained more books than she had ever seen in one place, 8,000 volumes, floor to ceiling, room after room, a cathedral of paper and leather and thought. And he had placed a single book in front of her and said the word that no one in her 27 years of life had ever spoken to her. Read. Not a request, not a test. A key offered without ceremony to a door she had been pressing her ear against for 15 years. Margaret looked down at the book. It was Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations, Volume 1, open to the chapter on the division of labor. A serious book, an important book. Not a primer, not a children's text, not the kind of simple material you would give someone you believed to be illiterate. He had given her this on purpose. He was not testing whether she could read. He was testing what she could understand. Her throat closed. Her hands, resting on the table, began to tremble. Not from fear, but from something larger and more dangerous than fear. From the accumulated pressure of 15 years of silence, 15 years of reading in the dark, 15 years of knowing that she was brilliant and being told she was nothing, all of it converging on this single moment, this single word, this single man watching her with blue eyes that held no mockery and no pity and no expectation except the truth. She opened her mouth. Her voice cracked on the first syllable, the way a door that has been sealed for years groans when it finally swings open. She heard the roughness, heard the disuse, heard 15 years of enforced silence in the ragged texture of the sound. But she did not stop. She read. And the words that came out of her were not halting, not fumbling, not the stumbling approximation of literacy that her father had led the world to expect. They were clear, precise, fluent. She read Adam Smith the way a musician plays a piece they have practiced in private for a decade, with authority, with understanding, with the quiet, devastating competence of someone who has mastered a thing that the world told them they were incapable of mastering. The Duke of Halford set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair, and Margaret, glancing up from the page, saw something on his face that she had never seen directed at her before. Not surprise, not admiration, recognition. The look of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected but could not prove. That the woman sitting across from him, the woman her father had called useless, the woman who had been brought to his house as payment for a debt, was extraordinary. Can I tell you something? There is a reason this kind of moment breaks us open. It is not the reading, it is not the book. It is the experience of being seen, truly seen, for what you actually are, by someone who is paying attention. Most of us go years, sometimes decades, without it. Some of us go a lifetime, and when it finally happens, when someone looks at you and sees not the version of you that the world has decided you are, but the version you have been building in secret, in silence, in the dark, that is the moment that changes everything. Welcome to Duke of Heart's Romance. Tonight I have that kind of story for you. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from right now? What city? What country? What time of day? Drop it in the comments. Whether you are curled up in bed, driving through traffic, or sitting in a quiet room after everyone else has gone to sleep, you are not listening alone. We are all here together. Tonight's story is about a woman whose own father told the world she was useless, who was denied education, denied dancing, denied every accomplishment that a woman in 1843 England needed to survive, because her intelligence frightened the man who was supposed to protect her. It is about a duke who lost his wife to the same lie, the lie that women are better kept ignorant, and who swore he would never let it happen again. And it is about what happens when that man walks into a dining room and hears a father say the words that killed the woman he loved, spoken about a woman he has not yet met. Let me take you there. The Lacey family lived at Briarfield House, a property in Dorset that had been described in its better days as a gentleman's residence of modest charm, and in its current state might more accurately be described as a gentleman's residence that the gentleman could no longer afford to maintain. The roof leaked in 3 places. The east wing had been closed for 4 years because the cost of heating it exceeded Sir Roland Lacey's willingness to pay. The gardens, once the pride of the county, had contracted to a kitchen plot and a stretch of overgrown lawn that the single remaining gardener attacked with more determination than skill. The stable held 2 horses where it had once held 12. The library, and this detail matters, so hold it, the library still contained Sir Roland's father's collection of 2,000 books, untouched, unread, gathering dust behind glass doors that Sir Roland had locked 7 years ago because he considered books an unnecessary expense, and reading an unnecessary activity. Sir Roland Lacey was the 3rd baronet of his line. He had inherited the title, the house, and 1,200 acres of productive farmland from his father, who had inherited it from his father, who had built the entire estate from nothing through a combination of intelligence, discipline, and the kind of relentless financial acumen that skips generations as reliably as red hair. It had skipped Sir Roland comprehensively. He was not stupid. This is important to understand because the story that follows makes more sense when you grasp the specific, corrosive nature of his mediocrity. Sir Roland Lacey was a man of average intelligence who had been born into a family that expected brilliance. His father had read Greek. His grandfather had built a fortune from raw land. Sir Roland could do neither. He could ride well, drink adequately, and maintain the appearance of a country gentleman whose affairs were in order, provided no one examined the affairs too closely. What he could not do, what he had never been able to do, was think. Not in the way his father had thought, with precision and strategy and the ability to see 3 moves ahead. Sir Roland thought in straight lines, in short distances, in the immediate and the obvious. He made decisions the way a man walking through fog makes decisions, by reacting to whatever loomed directly in front of him and hoping that the larger landscape would sort itself out. It had not sorted itself out. The estate was bleeding money. The tenants were restless. The farmland that his grandfather had made profitable through innovative crop rotation was now being managed with the same techniques that had been used 30 years ago because Sir Roland did not read agricultural journals and did not trust the people who did. And into this household of declining fortunes and defensive mediocrity, God had delivered 3 daughters and no sons. Now this mattered more than it should have, and I need to explain why. In 1843, the English law of primogeniture meant that estates passed to male heirs. Daughters could not inherit land. A baronet without sons was a title reaching a dead end. The land would pass to the nearest male relative, often a distant cousin with no attachment to the property and no obligation to the family. Sir Roland's lack of a male heir was not merely a personal disappointment. It was an existential crisis for the Lacey estate. Everything his grandfather had built, everything his father had maintained, would leave Lacey hands within a generation. This is the context in which Sir Roland looked at his three daughters and saw not children but failures, not people but problems, and the eldest, the one who was too clever, too observant, too much like the grandfather whose shadow Sir Roland could never escape, was the biggest problem of all. Margaret Eloise Lacey was born in June of 1816, and from the very beginning she was the wrong kind of child. Not wrong in any way that mattered. She was healthy, alert, curious, and possessed of the kind of focused, observant intelligence that would have delighted any parent who valued such things. But Sir Roland did not value such things in a daughter, and the specific way in which Margaret was wrong was this. She was clever, dangerously clever, obviously clever. Clever in a way that could not be hidden or disguised or redirected into acceptable channels. By the age of 5, she was reading books intended for children twice her age. By 7, she had taught herself basic arithmetic by watching the estate steward work the accounts. By 10, she was asking questions about crop yields and tenant agreements that Sir Roland could not answer, delivered in a clear, direct voice that carried the particular sting of a child who does not yet understand that knowing more than your father is, in certain households, an unforgivable offense. Her mother, Lady Helena Lacey, recognized what Margaret was. Helena had been a clever woman herself, the daughter of a clergyman who read widely and a mother who encouraged learning, and she saw in her eldest daughter the kind of mind that, properly nurtured, could accomplish extraordinary things. Helena died when Margaret was 11. A fever that started as a cough and ended 6 days later in a bedroom that smelled of camphor and grief, with Margaret holding her mother's hand and her father standing in the doorway, already calculating the cost of the funeral. Helena left behind 3 things: a brass ring that Margaret wore on her right hand and never removed, a half-finished letter to a friend recommending a governess for the girls, and a gap in the household that Sir Roland filled not with care but with control. The governess was dismissed within the year. Sir Roland announced that Margaret's education was complete. She was 12. She could read and write and manage basic household tasks, and any further learning was unnecessary and, more importantly, expensive. Her 2 younger sisters, Arabella and Louisa, then 9 and 7, were given a new governess, a cheaper one, focused on music, dancing, French, and the decorative accomplishments that would make them marriageable. Margaret received nothing, and here you need to understand what that meant in 1843. Education, for a woman of Margaret's class, was not about knowledge, it was about currency. The accomplishments a young woman displayed, her pianoforte, her watercolors, her French, her dancing, were not talents. They were qualifications. They were the résumé she presented at every ball, every assembly, every dinner party, in the hope of securing the one career available to her, marriage. A woman without accomplishments was a woman without employment prospects. She was, in the brutally economic language of the marriage market, unsaleable. Sir Roland knew this. He cut Margaret off from education, knowing exactly what he was doing. He was not merely neglecting her, he was ensuring that she would never leave. "She can already read," Sir Roland said when the vicar's wife inquired about the eldest girl's education. "What more does she need?" What he meant was, "She can already think, and I need her to stop." What he also meant, though he would never have admitted it, "I need her here, managing the things I cannot manage, and if she marries and leaves, I am finished." Because Margaret at 12 was already doing something that Sir Roland found both intolerable and indispensable. She was correcting him, and she was right. Quietly, politely, with the innocent precision of a child who genuinely does not understand that accuracy is threatening. She would mention at dinner that the barley yield he had cited was actually last year's figure, or that the tenant he had praised for punctual rent payments was in fact 3 months behind. Each correction was small, each was accurate, and each one reminded Sir Roland that his 12-year-old daughter had the mind he was supposed to have and didn't. He solved the problem the way he solved most problems, bluntly, permanently, and without concern for the damage. He locked the library. He dismissed the governess. He announced to the household, to the village, and to anyone who would listen that Margaret couldn't read properly anyway. The girl is slow, poor thing, not like her sisters. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who understood that a lie repeated often enough becomes functionally indistinguishable from the truth. And he gave Margaret a new role. She would manage the household. Not the decorative management that a lady of the house performed, the menus, the flowers, the guest lists, the real management, the accounts, the inventories, the servant wages, the maintenance schedules, the supply orders, the work that required precisely the kind of intelligence he was publicly denying she possessed. He needed her mind. He simply refused to admit it existed. Margaret understood what was happening. She was 12, not stupid, though her father was working hard to make the world believe otherwise. She understood that she was being erased and exploited simultaneously, that her father was using her intelligence while denying it, the way a man might use a lamp while insisting there is no light. But Margaret had something that most 12-year-olds do not. She had her mother's brass ring, her mother's memory, and her mother's advice, spoken 3 days before Helena died, in a voice already thinned by fever. They will try to make you small, Margaret. Let them think they have succeeded. And while they are not looking, grow. So Margaret grew. In secret. At night. By candlelight stolen from the kitchen. Candle stubs that the cook saved for her without being asked and without asking why, because the cook, Mrs. Harding, had known Lady Helena and had loved her and could see Helena's daughter being dismantled, piece by piece, and could do nothing about it except save candle stubs and look the other way. The library was locked, but Sir Roland had not considered that a house with a leaking roof and settling foundations might also have a library with a window latch that didn't quite catch. Margaret discovered this at 13. She oiled the latch with tallow from the kitchen. She entered the library through the window every night after the house was asleep, selected a book, brought it to her room, read it by candle stub, and returned it before dawn. She read everything. 2,000 volumes over 15 years, philosophy, history, political economy, natural science, Latin, French, agricultural theory, estate management, law. She read her grandfather's annotated collection of parliamentary debates and understood with growing precision exactly how badly her father was managing the estate. She read her grandmother's French novels and taught herself the language by comparing the text to the English translations shelved beside them. She read Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, Jeremy Bentham. She read poetry, Wordsworth, Byron, Keats, and discovered that words could do more than inform. They could feel. She kept no notebooks. That was too dangerous. Physical evidence could be found. Instead, she developed a memory that her father's steward would have envied, holding figures and facts and arguments in her head, the way a cathedral holds sound, every piece in its place, every echo accounted for. By 20, she was managing the estate in everything but name. The steward, Mr. Briggs, had recognized within a year that the eldest Lacey daughter had a better grasp of the accounts than he did. He began consulting her in private, bringing her the ledgers after dinner, accepting her suggestions without telling Sir Roland where they originated. When Margaret calculated that switching from barley to wheat on the eastern fields would increase revenue by £40 per annum, Briggs presented it to Sir Roland as his own idea. Sir Roland approved it. The revenue increased by £43. Margaret had been conservative in her estimate. This, incidentally, was not unusual. Across Regency England, estates were quietly managed by women, wives, daughters, sisters, whose contributions were credited to the men who owned the land. Agricultural histories of the period record dozens of innovative landowners whose innovations were, in private letters and diaries, attributed to wives who could never be publicly acknowledged. Margaret was not an exception. She was the rule. The difference was that most of these women were at least privately recognized by their families. Margaret was publicly erased. No one thanked her. No one acknowledged her. The money appeared in the accounts as though it had generated itself, and Sir Roland took credit for the improved yields at the quarterly meeting of the County Agricultural Society, while Margaret stood at the back of the room in a brown wool dress that had been her mother's and had been let out twice and taken up once and still didn't quite fit. Meanwhile, her sisters grew. Arabella, now 22, was beautiful in the approved manner. Blonde, slender, accomplished in pianoforte and watercolors. She had received 3 offers of marriage and was considering a 4th. Louisa, 20, was different, quieter, kinder, with a streak of observational sharpness that reminded Margaret painfully of their mother. Louisa was the only person in the household who looked at Margaret with something other than indifference. She brought Margaret tea without being asked. She lingered in doorways when Margaret was working the accounts, watching with an expression that was part curiosity, part guilt, part the dawning awareness of a young woman who is beginning to understand that the world she inhabits was built on her sister's invisible labor. "Why don't you come to the assembly on Saturday?" Louisa had asked 3 months ago, standing in Margaret's doorway with a cup of tea balanced on a saucer. "I have nothing to wear." "You could borrow something of mine." "I have nothing to do there, Louisa. I can't dance." "You could learn. I could teach you." Margaret had looked at her youngest sister, 20 years old, kind-hearted, wearing a dress that cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe, and felt the particular, complicated love of an older sister who wants to protect someone from the truth and knows she cannot. "Perhaps next time," Margaret said. There was never a next time. She had never learned to dance. Not because she couldn't. Margaret, who had taught herself Latin from a grammar book by candlelight, could certainly have learned to dance. But because Sir Roland had never paid for a dancing master, and you cannot learn to dance alone in a bedroom at midnight. And this mattered more than it should have, because dancing in Regency England was not merely entertainment. It was the primary social mechanism through which unmarried men and women were permitted to interact. A ball was not a party. It was a marketplace. The dance floor was where alliances were formed, courtships began, and futures were decided. A woman who could not dance was a woman who could not participate. She was present but excluded, visible but inaccessible, standing against the wall while the business of her life was conducted without her. At balls, and Sir Roland attended them regularly because maintaining social appearances was the one thing he did competently, Margaret stood against the wall. Every ball, every assembly, every county dance and harvest celebration. She stood in her brown dress with her mother's brass ring on her finger and her auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid, and she watched her sisters dance, and she felt the feeling of being in a room full of people and being fundamentally absent. She was 27 years old. In the brutal arithmetic of Regency-era marriage, she was finished. The word the village used was spinster, though some of the kinder women called her poor Miss Lacey, or the quiet one, or simply the eldest, as though her position in the birth order were the most interesting thing about her. Her father had a different word. He used it freely, openly, in the dining room and the drawing room and the village and anywhere else an audience could be found. Useless. He said it the way other men said "good morning," automatically, without emphasis, as though it were a simple fact of nature rather than a destruction of his own child, and he said it on a Tuesday evening in October of 1843 to the Duke of Halford. Alexander Wren, the 5th Duke of Halford, arrived at Briarfield House at 6 o'clock on an evening that smelled of rain and fallen leaves. He had come for a specific purpose, and that purpose was not entirely social. To understand Alexander, you need to understand two things about him: what he had lost and what he had built from the loss. What he had lost was Catherine. Catherine Price had been the daughter of a viscount, pretty, gentle, eager to please, and utterly denied the education that her quick mind had deserved. Her father, Viscount Ashburton, belonged to the school of thought that held female education to be not merely unnecessary, but actively dangerous, a view that was, it should be said, thoroughly mainstream in England in the 1820s. Mary Wollstonecraft had published her Vindication of the Rights of Woman 50 years earlier, arguing that women's apparent intellectual inferiority was the result of denied education rather than natural limitation. The book had been widely read and even more widely dismissed. The conservative backlash, fueled by the scandals of Wollstonecraft's personal life, had hardened opposition to women's education into something approaching consensus among the English gentry. Fathers like Viscount Ashburton were not exceptions. They were the norm. "A woman who reads," Ashburton had declared at a dinner party that Catherine overheard from the hallway at age 14, "is a woman who thinks, and a woman who thinks is a woman who argues, and a woman who argues is a woman no sensible man will marry." Catherine had internalized every word. She stopped asking for books. She stopped asking questions. She became what her father wanted: decorative, compliant, sweet. And she carried inside her, locked away like a room in a house that has been sealed shut, the nagging, persistent, unshakable suspicion that she might have been capable of more if someone had let her try. She married Alexander at 20. He was 32, already a duke, already involved in parliamentary reform. He was not a warm man. He was quiet, intense, more comfortable with policy papers than conversation. But he was decent, and he was observant, and within 6 months of marriage he had noticed something that no one in Catherine's life had ever bothered to notice. She was intelligent, not in the flashy, argumentative way that draws attention, in the quiet way, the way she listened, the way she remembered, the way she asked questions that cut through complexity with an instinct that no education had shaped and no encouragement had nurtured. Alexander began leaving books out for her, casually, as though by accident. He watched her pick them up, read a few pages, and put them down with a guilty expression, as though she had been caught doing something she shouldn't. It broke his heart. Catherine died in the winter of 1837, a fall from a horse, not dramatic, not tragic in the way stories prefer. She was riding slowly along a country lane, the horse stumbled on frozen ground, and she fell badly. A broken collarbone that developed an infection. She was gone within the week. In her final hours, fevered and fading, she had said something to Alexander that he would carry for the rest of his life. She had looked at him with glassy eyes and said, in a voice already leaving, "I think I could have been clever if someone had let me." Alexander had held her hand and said, "You were clever, you were always clever." But she was already gone, and the truth that Alexander carried, the truth that had shaped every decision he had made in the 6 years since, was this: He had seen what Catherine was. He had known, and he had not done enough, fast enough, forcefully enough, to undo the damage that had been done to her before he met her. He could not save Catherine, but he could make sure it never happened again. In Parliament, he became the most persistent advocate for female education reform in the House of Lords. He funded charity schools, he endowed scholarships, he wrote policy papers arguing that the economic cost of denying women education, the wasted intellectual capacity, the dependency on male relatives, the inefficiency of running a nation on half its minds, exceeded the cost of educating them by a factor he estimated at 12 to 1. His colleagues found the papers admirable in principle and inconvenient in practice. Personally, he withdrew. He did not remarry. He maintained Halford Park, a grand estate in Hampshire, with the library of 8,000 volumes that his grandfather had assembled, and he lived there with his books and his policy papers and the small leather notebook he carried in his breast pocket at all times. He was 38 years old, sandy-haired, going gray at the temples, broader and heavier than the aristocratic ideal, built more like a man who walked his own fields than a man who sat in drawing-rooms. A short, neatly trimmed beard that he had grown after Catherine's death because shaving every morning had felt, in those first terrible months, like an act of normalcy he could not perform. Blue eyes that held a permanent quality of assessment, laugh lines that hadn't been used in years. He was not feared like some dukes in stories. He was something more unsettling. He was principled, and principled men, in a world built on compromise and convenient ignorance, are more dangerous than cruel ones. But principles, left unchecked by self-awareness, have a way of becoming something else, something that looks like righteousness from the outside and feels like control from the inside. Alexander did not know this about himself yet. He would learn now. Alexander had come to Briarfield House for 2 reasons. The first was money. Sir Roland owed him £1,200, a mortgage acquired by Alexander's solicitor as part of a land consolidation across Dorset and Hampshire. The second reason was quieter, and Alexander had not fully admitted it to himself. His solicitor, in the course of acquiring the debt, had produced a report on the Lacey estate. The report noted irregular patterns in the accounts, a well-managed farm attached to a poorly managed household, as though 2 different minds were operating the same property. The solicitor had also noted complaints from 3 Lacey tenants about living conditions and a discrepancy between the estate's rental income and the amount reinvested in tenant housing. Alexander had read the report with the particular attention of a man who spent his parliamentary career investigating exactly this kind of mismanagement. He had come to Briarfield not merely to discuss a debt, but to see the estate for himself, to understand who was managing it well and who was managing it badly, and, if necessary, to intervene. The dinner was prepared with frantic energy. The silver was polished. Arabella was dressed in a cream gown that had cost more than Margaret's annual clothing allowance. Louisa was positioned at the pianoforte for a pre-dinner performance. The menu was ambitious for a household that had dismissed its second cook 3 months earlier. Margaret was given instructions. "You will sit at the end of the table," Sir Roland said. "You will not speak. If the Duke addresses you, which he will not, you will say as little as possible and direct his attention to your sisters. Is that clear?" "Yes, father." "And change that dress. You look like a servant. This is the only dress that fits. Then sit further from the candles." Margaret put on the brown wool dress that had been her mother's. She touched the brass ring on her right hand, and she went downstairs to take her place at the far end of the table, behind the soup tureen, in the shadows, where her father had decided she belonged. Alexander arrived. He was not what Margaret expected. She had imagined a duke would be polished, smooth, the kind of man who wore his wealth like a well-tailored coat. Alexander Wren looked like a man who had been reading in a carriage for 3 hours and had forgotten to brush his coat before entering. His sandy hair was slightly flattened on one side. His blue eyes, scanning the room with automatic assessment, were tired but alert. He carried himself with the particular posture of someone who is large enough to be physically imposing and socially conscious enough to try not to be. And in his breast pocket, visible against the dark charcoal of his coat, the edge of a small leather notebook. Margaret noticed the notebook the way she noticed everything, automatically, instinctively, because details were the currency of her secret life. A man who carried a notebook was a man who recorded thoughts. A man who recorded thoughts was a man who had them. The dinner began. Sir Roland performed. He praised Arabella's beauty. He described Louisa's musical talents. He outlined the Lacey family history with selective editing that omitted the leaking roof, the closed east wing, and the £1,200 he owed the man sitting across from him. Alexander listened. His eyes moved. Margaret saw it immediately. The Duke was scanning the room, noting the repaired tablecloth, the mismatched candlesticks, the places where the household's carefully maintained surface showed its cracks. He was reading the room the way Margaret read books, for what was underneath. The moment came between the fish and the meat. Sir Roland was describing his daughter's accomplishments. He gestured to Arabella. Accomplished in watercolors, pianoforte, and French. He gestured to Louisa. A natural dancer, the finest in the county. Alexander's gaze drifted toward the far end of the table. "And your eldest daughter?" Alexander asked. Sir Roland's expression shifted. A flicker of irritation, quickly managed. He waved his hand, the gesture that Margaret had seen 1,000 times, the casual, backhanded wave that reduced her to an afterthought. "Margaret? Oh!" He laughed. Not cruel, not malicious, just dismissive, the sound of a man swatting away something insignificant. "She can't read, she can't dance, she's useless, not like her sisters. But we keep her on. Family, duty!" The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Margaret did not flinch. She had heard them before. She pressed her mother's brass ring against her thigh beneath the table and held her face perfectly still. Alexander Wren set down his fork. Not dramatically. He simply placed it on the edge of his plate with the careful, deliberate precision of a man who needs both hands free, because the thing he is about to do requires his full attention. He looked at Sir Roland. Then he looked at Margaret. Then he looked back at Sir Roland. "She can't read," Alexander repeated. "Not a word," Sir Roland confirmed cheerfully. "We tried, of course, when she was young. Governesses, tutors, the usual. Nothing took. And she can't dance. 2 left feet." Sir Roland laughed again. "You said she's useless." Something in Alexander's voice had changed. Not louder, quieter. The particular dangerous quiet of a man who is controlling something large and volatile inside his chest. Margaret heard it. Sir Roland did not. "Well," Sir Roland spread his hands, "I wouldn't put it so harshly, but—" "You would put it exactly that harshly," Alexander said. "You just did." The table went silent. Arabella's eyes widened. Louisa's hand froze on her glass. The footman by the sideboard looked at the floor. Margaret saw Louisa's face, and what she saw there was not confusion. It was recognition. A flush of shame spreading across her youngest sister's cheeks. Louisa knew. She had always known, on some level, that what their father said about Margaret was wrong. She had brought tea and lingered in doorways and offered dancing lessons because she knew. But knowing and acting are different things, and Louisa, at 20, had not yet found the courage to close that gap. Sir Roland blinked. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" Alexander did not repeat himself. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her, across the full length of the table, past the tureen, past the candles, past 15 years of erasure, and what Margaret saw in his blue eyes was not pity. It was fury, cold, controlled, deeply personal fury. He did not say anything to Margaret, not yet. He turned back to Sir Roland. "I believe we have business to discuss," Alexander said. "The debt." Sir Roland, relieved to change the subject, launched into his prepared speech about repayment terms, a complicated web of partial payments, deferred interest, and creative accounting that boiled down to, "I cannot pay you." Alexander listened. When Sir Roland finished, Alexander said, "No." "I beg your pardon? No, I require the full amount, £1,200, within 30 days. The colour left Sir Roland's face. £1,200 in 30 days was impossible. Paying it would require selling land, Lacey land, ancestral land. The end. "Your Grace," Sir Roland said, and for the first time his voice held genuine fear, "I cannot possibly—" "There is an alternative." Sir Roland leaned forward with the desperate eagerness of a drowning man spotting timber. "Yes? My solicitor's report indicates that your estate is being managed by 2 different minds, one competent, one not. The tenant complaints suggest the incompetent mind controls the purse. I came here to understand the discrepancy. I believe I now understand it." He paused. Sir Roland had gone very still. "I need a librarian," Alexander said. "Someone to catalogue the collection at Halford Park. 8,000 volumes. The work would take approximately 6 months. In exchange for this service, I would forgive the debt in full." Sir Roland frowned. "A librarian?" "Your eldest daughter." The room stopped. "She can't read," Sir Roland said automatically. "Then she will be a poor librarian," Alexander said, "and I will call in the debt publicly, at the next county meeting, with the solicitor's report attached, including the tenant complaints and the discrepancy in your accounts. The choice is yours." The threat landed with surgical precision. Not just the money, the exposure. Sir Roland's entire existence was built on the appearance of competence. The solicitor's report, made public, would strip that appearance away. The county would see what Margaret had always seen, a man who could not manage what he had inherited. Sir Roland looked at Margaret, not with love, not with guilt, not with anything resembling the feeling a father should have when bargaining away his daughter. With calculation, one fewer person to feed, one fewer reminder of his own inadequacy. The debt erased. "Take her," Sir Roland said. "When do you need her?" "Tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" A flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by relief. "I will send a carriage at 8 o'clock, Alexander said. He pushed back his chair. "Thank you for dinner, Sir Roland. The fish was adequate." He left without looking at Margaret again. Margaret sat at the table after the Duke had gone, and the footman had begun clearing, and her father had retreated to his study. She sat in her brown wool dress, and she stared at the candles guttering in their holders, and she felt, beneath the shock, something unexpected. Curiosity. 8,000 volumes. A man with a notebook in his breast pocket who had said, "You just did," with a voice like a closing door. A library. A real library she was being ordered to enter. A footstep behind her. Louisa, standing in the dining-room doorway in her evening dress, eyes red. "Margaret, go to bed, Louisa. He's horrible. Father is... What he said about you, it's not... I know what it's not." Margaret's voice was gentler than she intended. "Go to bed." Will you write to me? From the Duke's house?" Margaret looked at her youngest sister, the one who brought tea, the one who offered dancing lessons, the one who knew the truth and didn't have the power to change it. She loved Louisa with the fierce, protective, slightly exhausted love of an older sister who has been parenting since she was 12. "I will write," Margaret said. "Promise." "I promise." Louisa crossed the room and hugged her, quickly, fiercely, the way you hold something you are afraid of losing. Then she was gone. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed at the back of the house, and she thought about what the Duke had said, or rather, what he hadn't said. He hadn't defended her. He hadn't made a speech. He had simply changed the terms of the debt and removed her from her father's house in under 5 minutes. He had done something, not words, action. The carriage arrived at 8 o'clock. Margaret was ready. She owned almost nothing: 3 dresses, her mother's brass ring, a woolen cloak, and the contents of her memory, which was the most valuable thing she possessed, and the one thing her father had never managed to confiscate. Halford Park was 3 hours by carriage. When they arrived, Margaret stepped down onto a gravel drive and looked up at a house that made Briarfield look like a cottage. Symmetrical Georgian facade, tall windows, grounds rolling in every direction, parkland, woods, a lake in the distance. A housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, met her at the door, stout, warm-faced, efficient. "Miss Lacey, welcome. Your room is upstairs, a proper bedroom, not a cupboard. The Duke will see you in the library at 10 o'clock. She paused. "He also asked me to tell you that breakfast will be served at the dining table, not on a separate tray." Margaret's throat tightened. He had seen everything, and his first instruction was to undo it. The library was everything. 3 connected rooms, floor-to-ceiling shelves in dark oak, 8,000 volumes, a rolling ladder on brass rails, a marble fireplace with a fire already lit, leather armchairs, a mahogany desk by the window with a reading lamp, a fresh inkwell, and a stack of blank cataloging cards. And light. The library was full of light. Tall windows on 2 walls, morning sun streaming in. This was not a locked room visited in darkness through a faulty window. This was a room built to be entered. She stood in the doorway and pressed her hand against the frame and breathed. "The cataloging system is straightforward," said a voice behind her. She turned. Alexander stood in the corridor, holding a cup of tea and his leather notebook. Charcoal coat, no cravat. The clothing of a man in his own home who sees no reason to perform. "Each volume needs to be recorded by title, author, subject, and condition," he said, walking to the desk. "The cards are here. The system is alphabetical within—" He stopped. He had been about to say, "literacy." He caught himself. Instead, he picked up a book from the desk, Adam Smith, and placed it in front of the chair. "Read," he said. And that is the moment where this story began, where Margaret's voice cracked on the first syllable and 15 years of silence came, pouring out as fluency, as precision, as devastating competence. She read for 10 minutes. She read Adam Smith with comprehension and the occasional pause to note where his argument weakened. Observations delivered in an undertone, as though she had forgotten anyone was listening. Alexander did not interrupt. When she stopped, he said, "Your father told me you couldn't read." "My father tells people many things." "How long have you been reading?" "Since I was 5. "And the Latin and French I noticed you parsing in that passage?" "I taught myself, from books in my father's locked library, through a window, at night." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed the air in the room. "My wife was told the same lie, that her mind was a liability. She died believing it." Margaret set down the book. "What was her name?" "Catherine." "How did she die?" "A riding accident. But the injury isn't what killed her. The infection is what killed her. Body. What killed her spirit. That happened years before I met her, in her father's house, when she was 14 and overheard him say that a woman who thinks is a woman, no man will marry." The library was silent except for the fire. "The last thing she said to me," Alexander continued, and his voice was rough now, the roughness of a man handling something he normally keeps locked away, was, "I think I could have been clever if someone had let me." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, crack, the way ice cracks before it gives way. "She was clever," Margaret said quietly. "Yes, she was. And I was too slow to make her believe it." He stood. He walked to the window. He composed himself with deliberate effort. "I did not bring you here only to be a librarian, Miss Lacey. I brought you here because I heard your father say words I have heard before, and I know what those words do. I know the damage they cause, and I will not watch it happen again." He turned. "You are welcome to stay as long as you wish. You may read any book in this library. You may use the desk, the paper, the ink. The debt is forgiven regardless. You owe me nothing." Margaret stared at him. In 27 years, no one had ever offered her anything without conditions. "Why?" she asked. "Because someone should have done this for Catherine, and no one did." I want to pause here for a moment, because this is where the story shifts. Up to now, this has been a story about damage, about a father who destroyed his daughter's identity to protect his own ego, about a woman who built her mind in secret because the world refused to let her build it in the open. But from this moment, from the moment Alexander Wren says, "You owe me nothing," and means it, this becomes a story about what happens when the door finally opens. And that part is harder. Not harder to live through, harder to believe. Because when you have spent your entire life being told you are nothing, the most terrifying thing in the world is not continued cruelty. It is unexpected kindness. Kindness you haven't earned, kindness you don't trust, kindness that might be withdrawn at any moment, because everything good in your life has always been withdrawn eventually. If you know that feeling, if you have ever been handed something good and spent every moment waiting for it to be taken away, tell me in the comments. I want to know. The first week was the hardest. Margaret catalogued. She worked methodically, precisely, moving through the first room shelf by shelf, recording each volume with the thoroughness of a woman who has been managing accounts since she was 12 and who understands that accuracy is sacred. She did not read aloud again. The first time had cost her something, an exposure, a vulnerability, and she retreated into the safety of silence. She avoided the Duke whenever possible. She ate breakfast at the dining table because Mrs. Calloway insisted, but she ate quickly and left before Alexander arrived. Alexander noticed. He did not push. He left books on the library desk, books he thought she might enjoy, books related to topics she had mentioned. He left them without comment and did not ask if she had read them. But the books were always moved by morning, returned to the shelf, but with a cataloging card that included, in addition to the standard information, a brief critical note in small, precise handwriting. The critical notes were extraordinary. Margaret's assessment of Hume's treatise ran to 3 sentences and contained an observation about the relationship between custom and moral reasoning that Alexander had never encountered in any published commentary. Her note on Ricardo's principles identified a mathematical error in the 3rd chapter that Alexander's own reading had missed. He began checking the cards every morning the way other men checked the post, eagerly, with anticipation. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became 4. The silence between them began to soften, not through conversation, but through the accumulated weight of shared space. Margaret grew accustomed to the sound of Alexander's pen scratching in the next room. Alexander grew accustomed to the soft thud of books being reshuffled on shelves. They orbited each other like planets, separate, defined, but held in place by the same gravity. On the 19th day, Margaret found Catherine's journal. It was in the third room of the library, the room Alexander thought of as Catherine's room because it was where he had kept her things: a writing desk, a small watercolor of the garden, and a journal, leather-bound, tucked behind a row of books, as though someone had tried to both preserve and hide it. Margaret was sitting at the desk, the journal open in front of her, when Alexander appeared in the doorway. She was not reading it. She was staring at a single page, her hand covering her mouth, her green eyes, bright with tears she was refusing to shed. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, standing quickly. "I found it while cataloguing. I shouldn't have— What page?" She hesitated. Then she opened the journal and pointed. Alexander looked. He knew the entry. Catherine's handwriting, looping, uncertain, the handwriting of a woman who had been told that her letters were poorly formed and who had believed it. The entry read, "I think I could have been clever if someone had let me. Alexander says I am clever already, but he is kind, and kind people say things that are not always true. I wish I knew. I wish someone had taught me enough for me to know whether I am what he says or what Father said. I am afraid it is the latter. I am afraid I will always be afraid it is the latter." "She wrote it 3 months before she died," Alexander said. "She was clever," Margaret said. Her voice was rough. "You can see it in the handwriting, the way she structures her thoughts. She argues with herself, presents evidence, considers counter-arguments. That's not an uneducated mind. That's an educated mind that was told it was uneducated." Alexander leaned against the doorframe. He pressed his hand against the leather notebook in his breast pocket. "No one has ever said that to me before," he said, "about her writing." "No one who read it had been told the same lie," Margaret said. "I recognize it because I have lived it. Your wife and I, our fathers, used different words, but they built the same cage." The silence that followed was full of recognition, full of the particular charged understanding that exists between two people who have touched the same wound from different sides. After that day, something opened. Not romantically, not yet. Something more foundational. Trust. The specific, hard-won trust of two people who have each been hurt by a particular kind of lie and who recognize in each other someone who understands the damage without needing it, explained. Margaret began reading aloud again. In the evenings after dinner, which they now ate together, she would choose a passage and share it. Sometimes political economy, sometimes poetry. Alexander would listen, and then they would argue. Not quarrel, argue, the way two minds argue when they are well matched, with precision and respect, and the electric pleasure of disagreement that makes both parties sharper. He began sharing, too, his parliamentary work, his education reform proposals, the particular frustration of a man surrounded by colleagues who could not see what he saw. Margaret listened with total attention and the occasional devastating interjection. "You are assuming that Parliament will act from moral conviction," she said one evening after he had outlined his latest proposal. "They will not. They will act from economic interest, frame it as an investment, not a charity. Show them the numbers, the productivity of educated women, the cost of dependency, the economic waste of unutilized intelligence. Give them a ledger, not a sermon." Alexander stared at her. Then he opened his notebook and began writing. "What are you doing?" recording what you just said before I forget it and present a less effective version to the House of Lords. You cannot use my words in Parliament. I can if they're better than mine. It was during the 5th week that Alexander made his mistake. Margaret had been writing, not cataloguing, but writing, her own thoughts on paper for the first time. She had filled 3 cataloguing cards with notes so extensive they had become miniature essays, and she was now working on a proper piece, an argument about estate management and the economic waste of excluding women from agricultural decisions. She left the draft on the library desk overnight. The next morning she found Alexander reading it. "This is exceptional," he said, looking up. "You should publish it." "I haven't finished it. When you finish it, I'll send it to my publisher. I know the editor of the Agricultural Review personally. He owes me a favor. I can have it placed within the month." He said it casually, generously, the way a man says something when he believes he is helping. And Margaret heard, not the generosity, not the kindness, but the control, the assumption, the casual deployment of his power over her work without her permission. "You read my draft without asking," she said. Alexander blinked. "It was on the desk." "It was on my desk. The desk you told me was mine. I didn't—" "You didn't think. You saw something I had written, and you picked it up, and you read it, and now you are telling me what to do with it, who to send it to, how to publish it, through your connections, your publisher, your favor." She stood. Her voice was level, but her green eyes were blazing. "For 15 years, my father used my mind without my permission. He took my calculations, my ideas, my numbers, and he presented them as his own. He used what I could do while denying that I could do it, and now you, who are kinder than him, who mean well, who genuinely believe you are helping, you are doing the same thing. You are taking my work and routing it through your power. You are making my achievement your gift to give." The library was very quiet. Alexander set the draft down on the desk. He looked at Margaret with an expression she had not seen before, not the fury of the dinner table, not the careful kindness of the library, but something raw, shock, the shock of a man who has just been shown a mirror he did not know he needed. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right. He stopped. He pressed his hand against the notebook in his breast pocket. The gesture she had learned meant he was thinking carefully. "I have spent 6 years trying to be the man Catherine needed me to be. The man who opens doors, who removes obstacles, who makes things possible for women that the world won't make possible on its own. And I have been so focused on opening doors that I did not consider that opening a door for someone and pushing them through it are not the same thing." He looked at her. "I am sorry. I will not read your work without permission. I will not send it anywhere without your request. And when you are ready, if you are ready, you will choose the publisher, the timing, and the terms. It will be yours. Not my gift. Yours." Margaret stood very still. In 27 years, no one had ever apologized to her with that kind of precision. Not the vague, defensive sorry of a man who is sorry he got caught, but the specific, accountable sorry of a man who understood exactly what he had done wrong and was naming it aloud. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Catherine never did. She never told me when I was doing too much, deciding too much, steering her toward what I thought she needed. She was too afraid to disagree with anyone, even someone who loved her. You are not afraid. That is a gift I do not deserve and will try to be worthy of." Something shifted between them after that evening. The careful distance they had maintained, the professional boundary of employer and librarian, developed a crack, Not a romantic crack, a human one. The crack that forms when two people have been honest with each other about something that mattered and have survived it. Margaret noticed the change in small ways. Alexander began asking before leaving books on her desk. "I came across something you might find interesting. Shall I leave it?" A question that cost him nothing and meant everything. He started knocking on the library door before entering, even though it was his library, his house, his door. Small gestures of deference that announced, "This space is yours, and I am a guest in it," and Margaret, in turn, began to thaw. Not dramatically. She was not a dramatic woman, and the ice that 15 years of concealment had built around her did not melt in a single warming. It softened, incrementally. The way she sat changed, less rigidly upright, less the posture of a woman bracing for inspection. She began leaving her own books on the desk beside his, not hidden, not tucked away, but openly, as though she had the right to occupy space. One evening in early November, she laughed. It happened without warning. Alexander had been describing a parliamentary debate in which two elderly lords had argued for 45 minutes about the proper Latin plural of memorandum, each insisting on a different declension, while the legislation they were supposed to be debating sat untouched. And Margaret had laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a managed laugh, but a real one, sudden and bright and startling to both of them. She covered her mouth immediately, the reflexive gesture of a woman who has been trained to minimize herself. Alexander looked at her. "Don't do that," he said quietly. "Do what?" "Cover your mouth when you laugh. Your laugh is the best sound in this house." Margaret lowered her hand. She did not laugh again that evening. But the next evening, when Alexander described a visiting politician who had confused Edinburgh with Edgware and insisted he had travelled to Scotland for the afternoon, she laughed without covering her mouth. And Alexander, who had not heard a woman laugh in his home since Catherine, felt something inside his chest reassemble itself into a shape he had almost forgotten. Mrs. Calloway observed all of this with the professional satisfaction of a housekeeper who had been running a house for a lonely man for 6 years and who recognized with the instinct of a woman who had seen a great deal of life that the library was becoming something it had not been since Catherine's death. Alive. The weeks deepened. October became November, then December. The library catalogue grew. Margaret's confidence grew with it. Not the false confidence of someone performing competence, but the genuine, rooted confidence of a woman who is using her mind in the open for the first time and discovering that the open does not destroy her. She wrote to Louisa. The first letter she had ever sent, 3 pages long, more words than she had spoken to her youngest sister in years. Louisa wrote back immediately, her handwriting messy with emotion. I always knew what you were. I am so sorry I didn't do more. I brought you tea when I should have brought you a key." Margaret read the letter in the library and pressed it against her chest and cried, quietly, privately, the tears of a woman processing a kindness she had not expected. She wrote to Mrs. Harding, the cook at Briarfield who had saved candle stubs for 15 years. The letter was short. "Thank you for the light." Mrs. Harding wrote back 4 words. "I always knew, dear." She finished her essay. On her own terms, on her own timeline, without Alexander's publisher or Alexander's favor. She sent it herself to the Agricultural Review under the name Margaret Lacey, submitted through the post, with no covering letter from a duke. And here I should tell you how extraordinary this was. In 1843, women did publish, but almost never under their own names, and almost never on topics as aggressively male-dominated as agricultural economics. The convention was to use initials, pen names, or no attribution at all. A woman who attached her full name to an essay on crop rotation and tenant management was not merely publishing. She was making a statement. She was saying, "This mind belongs to a person, and that person has a name, and that name is a woman's." The essay would not appear for 3 months. Periodicals in the 1840s moved slowly. Submissions were reviewed, typeset by hand, and printed on schedules that reflected the pace of horse-drawn mail, not urgency. Margaret sent it in December. It would appear in March. In the meantime, she learned to dance. Alexander hired a dancing master. He did not ask Margaret first. He mentioned one evening that a Mr. Petworth would be arriving Tuesday for instruction in the waltz, the quadrille, and the country dances that constituted the standard repertoire. Margaret looked at him across the library. "I didn't ask for a dancing master." "No, but your father denied you one, and I don't believe his decisions should stand as permanent policy." He paused. He caught himself. "Unless you don't want one? In which case Mr. Petworth will be sent home with my apologies and a generous fee for his time." Margaret saw it, the correction, the self-awareness, the memory of their argument about the draft. He had learned. He was offering, not deciding. "I want one," she said, "but I will be terrible. I look forward to it." The lessons began awkwardly. Margaret was stiff, self-conscious. She had spent her life being a mind, not a body, and the transition was disorienting. She stepped on Mr. Petworth's toes 4 times in the first lesson. "Miss Lacey," the dancing master said gently, "the purpose of mistakes is to make the correct steps feel like a victory." By the 3rd lesson, she was competent. By the 6th, she was good. Not graceful in the conventional sense, but strong, direct, present. She danced the way she argued, with conviction. The Christmas assembly was held at the village hall near Halford Park. It was a modest affair. Local gentry, the vicar, the doctor, farmers in their best coats. Alexander attended because Mrs. Calloway informed him he would attend, and Mrs. Calloway was not a woman who accepted refusals. Margaret wore a new dress. Dark green, simple, well-fitted, the first new dress she had owned in 7 years. Her auburn hair was braided and pinned with a simple silver clip that Mrs. Calloway had produced from somewhere. Her mother's brass ring shone on her right hand. She was terrified, not of the dancing, of being seen. For 15 years she had been invisible, the woman against the wall, the one nobody asked, the quiet one. Walking into a room where people would look at her, would see her face, would expect her to participate. It felt like stepping off a cliff. Alexander offered his arm. She took it. They walked in together. And when the music began, a country dance, simple, familiar from Mr. Petworth's lessons, Alexander turned to her and said, "Miss Lacey, may I have this dance?" She took his hand. They danced. She was not perfect. She missed a step, recovered, missed another, recovered again. But Alexander was steady, patient, and strong enough to anchor her when she stumbled. And somewhere in the middle of the dance, between the second turn and the third, Margaret stopped thinking about her feet. She stopped thinking about the room. She stopped thinking about 15 years of standing against walls. She looked up at Alexander and saw him, looking down at her with an expression that was not pity, not kindness, not even admiration. It was joy. The startled, unguarded joy of a man who has not danced in 6 years and who is discovering that his body still remembers how, and that the woman in his arms is the reason it remembers. And Margaret, who had never danced at a ball, who had stood against every wall in Dorset, who had been told she was useless so many times she had almost believed it. Margaret smiled. not the careful, measured smile of a woman managing her expression. A real smile, the kind that starts in the eyes and rewrites the face entirely. The room noticed. Of course it did. A duke dancing with a woman no one recognized, both of them smiling as though the rest of the world had temporarily ceased to exist. That was the kind of thing rooms noticed. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "His librarian, I heard," someone else replied. "She can't be just a librarian. Look at the way he looks at her." Margaret heard none of it. She was dancing. For the first time in her life, she was dancing. After the dance ended, they stood at the edge of the floor. Margaret's cheeks were flushed, her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the physical shock of being seen, being touched, being in the center of a room instead of its margins. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked. "Terrified," she said, "and wonderful, which I think might be the same thing." He smiled. The real smile, the one that used the laugh lines, the one that Margaret had been coaxing out of him for months without realizing she was doing it. And standing at the edge of that modest village dance floor, with the candles guttering and the fiddle player starting a new tune, Margaret understood something she had not understood before. She was not afraid of Alexander. She was not afraid of his power, his wealth, his title. She was afraid of what he made her feel, which was visible, which was present, which was the opposite of everything she had been for 15 years. He made her feel like a woman who took up space, and taking up space, for Margaret Lacey, was still the most dangerous thing in the world. They danced twice more that evening. They talked between dances about Ricardo, about the committee report Alexander was drafting, about whether Wordsworth's later poetry was a decline or a maturation, a debate that grew so heated that the vicar's wife gently suggested they might continue it at a lower volume. Walking to the carriage afterward, their breath making clouds in the December air, Margaret's hand was on Alexander's arm. She did not remember putting it there. She did not remove it. The carriage ride home was quiet, the good quiet, the quiet of two people who have shared an evening and do not need to fill the aftermath with noise. The Halford Park Drive appeared in the darkness, lanterns at the door, Mrs. Calloway waiting with tea. "Good night, Alexander," Margaret said in the entrance hall. "Good night, Margaret." She climbed the stairs. At the landing she paused and looked back. He was still standing in the hall below, watching her, his notebook in his hand, his expression the particular, undefended expression of a man who has just danced with the woman he loves and who is trying very hard not to say so. Margaret went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She pressed her mother's brass ring against her lips. "I think I might be happy," she whispered. And the sound of her own voice saying it in a room that was warm and large and hers was the strangest sound she had ever heard. Then Sir Roland came. It was a morning in late January. Margaret was in the library cataloguing the natural philosophy section when Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway with alarm on her face. "Your father is here, Miss Lacey." Margaret's hand went still. The air cooled. "He is in the entrance hall. He is insistent." Sir Roland stood in the center of Halford, Park's grand entrance like a man who has marched into a room and is only now realizing that the room is larger than he expected. His face was ruddy with hot temper. "Margaret, you're coming home." "Good morning, Father." "Don't good morning me. I've had a letter from Briggs. The accounts are wrong. The tenants' rents are miscalculated. The winter stores are insufficiently provisioned. I need you to fix it." Margaret looked at her father. She looked at him the way she had never been able to look at him while living under his roof, directly, clearly, without flinching. "No," Margaret said. In 27 years she had never said no to him, not once. "I beg your pardon?" "No, father, I am not coming home. You are my daughter. You will do as I say. I am your daughter. I am not your property, and I will not do as you say, not any more. Now listen here. No, you listen." Her voice was steady, level, the voice of a woman who had spent 15 years building arguments in her head and who was now delivering one. "You told the Duke of Halford that I cannot read. I have read every book in your library, every single one of 2,000 volumes, through a window at night by stolen candlelight, because you locked the door when I was 12. You told him I cannot dance. You never paid for a dancing master. You paid for Arabella's. You paid for Louisa's. You did not pay for mine. You told him I am useless. I have managed your estate accounts since I was 14. The switch to wheat on the eastern fields was my calculation. The tenant renegotiations were my numbers. The winter provisioning schedule you cannot complete is a system I designed when I was 19. She took a breath. Sir Roland had gone white. "You told the world I am nothing, and then you built your household on what I could do. You used my mind every day while telling everyone it didn't exist. You ate the food my calculations put on your table and wore the coat my management paid for and stood at agricultural society meetings taking credit for my ideas, and you called me useless." She stepped forward. Sir Roland moved back. "I am not coming home. I am not fixing your accounts. I am not standing behind the soup tureen at your dinner table in a dress that doesn't fit while you tell your guests that I am nothing. That is over. And you ended it yourself. The night you sold me to a duke for £1,200. You did not sell me. You set me free, and you did it by accident, which is the most honest thing you have done in my entire life. Miss Lacey." Alexander stood at the top of the stairs. His blue eyes were fixed on Sir Roland with cold assessment. "Sir Roland, you appear to have arrived uninvited. I've come for my daughter." "Your daughter is under my employment. She is under contract." "She can't read." Alexander descended the stairs. He stood beside Margaret, not in front, beside, a positioning that was deliberate and that Margaret noticed. "Sir Roland, your daughter has produced the most sophisticated literary catalogue I have seen in 20 years of collecting. Her critical notes have informed a parliamentary speech I will deliver next month. Her understanding of agricultural management exceeds that of my steward." He paused. "She can read, she can think, she can argue, calculate, analyze, and reason with a precision I have encountered in perhaps 3 other minds in my lifetime. She achieved this entirely alone, in secret, with no help except a window that didn't latch and candle stubs saved by a cook." He looked at Sir Roland the way Margaret had seen him look at the dining table that first night, with the quiet devastation of a man deploying his full power. "Additionally," Alexander said, his voice dropping, "my solicitor has completed a full audit of your estate's accounts. The discrepancies between rental income and tenant housing reinvestment are significant. The tenant complaints have been documented. If you wish, I can have this report submitted to the county magistrate for review. Or you can leave this house, return to Briarfield, and manage your own affairs. Badly, I expect, but that is your concern, and no longer your daughter's." Sir Roland looked between Alexander and Margaret. The Duke and the daughter, the power and the proof. He saw, perhaps for the first time, the shape of what he had created, a woman he had called useless, standing in a duke's library with a duke at her side, and the full machinery of aristocratic and legal authority pointed at his chest. He left. He had no choice. The carriage drove away. The entrance hall was quiet. Margaret stood very still. Her hands were shaking. "Margaret," Alexander said. "My name is Margaret," she said. Her voice was rough. "Margaret," he said it carefully. Would you like to sit down? No, I would like to go back to the library. I was in the middle of the natural philosophy section. Alexander looked at her, this woman who had just dismantled her father and was now requesting to return to cataloguing, and felt the last wall inside him give way. Margaret, he said again, not as a name, as a declaration. She heard it. She looked at him directly, without flinching. Not yet, she said quietly. I need to finish becoming myself before I become anything to anyone else. Can you understand that? Yes. Will you wait? I have been waiting for 6 years, Alexander said. I can wait longer. She nodded. She walked back to the library. Her hands were still shaking, but she was smiling. The winter released its grip slowly. February brought early crocuses in the Halford Park gardens and a letter from the Agricultural Review. Margaret's essay had been accepted. It would appear in the March edition. March arrived, the essay appeared, under the name Margaret Lacey. Not initials, not a pen name. Her full name, printed, permanent, public. And here I should tell you what that name on that page meant in 1843. The world of periodical publishing was not closed to women, but it was hostile to them. The great female writers of the age published under male pseudonyms. The Bronte sisters would debut as Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell just 4 years later, precisely because a woman's name on a novel's spine was considered a commercial and intellectual liability. Mary Shelley had published Frankenstein anonymously. Even Jane Austen's novels bore only "by a lady" on their title pages during her lifetime. To publish under your full name as a woman in a male-dominated journal like the Agricultural Review was not merely an act of authorship. It was an act of defiance. It was saying, I exist, I think, and I will not hide behind a man's name or a man's initials to earn the right to be heard. Margaret had considered a pen name. She had considered initials. She had sat at the library desk with the submission letter in front of her and Alexander's voice. In her head, it will be yours, not my gift. And she had written her full name at the top of the essay because she understood, with the hard-won clarity of a woman who had been nameless for too long, that a pen name would be just another form of the concealment her father had imposed on her. She had spent 15 years hiding. She would not hide this. Over the following weeks, the essay circulated. It was cited in a committee report on agricultural reform. It was read by 3 members of Parliament. It was discussed at the Dorset County Agricultural Society meeting, the same quarterly meeting Margaret had attended for years, standing at the back in her brown dress, while her father took credit for her ideas. The chairman read a passage aloud and said, "This Miss Lacey appears to understand estate management better than half the landowners in Dorset." Sir Roland was in attendance. He sat in the 3rd row with his hands on his knees and his face the color of chalk. He did not speak. He did not take credit. He could not. The name on the essay was hers, and every man in the room who had ever heard him call his daughter useless was now reading her words and doing the arithmetic. After the meeting, the vicar approached Sir Roland and said, with the careful innocence of a man who knows exactly what he is doing, "I had no idea your eldest was so accomplished, Sir Roland. You must be very proud." Sir Roland said nothing. He went home. He poured a brandy. He sat in his study, the study with the locked library next door, the library with the faulty window latch, and he stared at the wall. Whether he felt regret or merely the fury of a man whose lie has been publicly exposed, only he knew. The story does not require us to forgive him to understand him. It only requires us to see him clearly. A man of average ability who destroyed his extraordinary daughter because her existence made his limitations visible. He did not deserve forgiveness. He deserved exactly what he got: an empty house, a mismanaged estate, and a daughter's name in print where his had never been. Spring deepened. The catalogue was nearly complete. Margaret had been at Halford Park for 6 months, and the question of what happened next had become unavoidable. It was Margaret who addressed it. "The catalogue is almost finished," she said one evening in the library. "Yes," Alexander said. "The debt was forgiven months ago. I have no reason to stay." "No." "So I should leave." Alexander set down his book. He looked at her with the direct, unshielded expression of a man who has stopped pretending. "You should do whatever you choose. That has always been the point." "What would you choose?" "I would stay, but I am not objective." "Why would you stay?" "Because the alternative, the library without you, the evenings without your voice, the mornings without your notes on my cataloguing cards, is a silence I have already survived once and cannot survive again." Margaret looked at this man who had taken her from her father's house without conditions, who had opened his library without expectations, who had waited 6 months without pressure, who had stood beside her when her father came, who had apologized when he overstepped and learned from the apology. "Catherine told you she wished someone had let her be clever," Margaret said. "Yes. You let me be clever, but that is not why I am staying." "No." "I am staying because you were not surprised. Everyone else, my father, the village, the servants, when they see what I can do, they are shocked. You were not shocked. You expected it, as though you knew before I read a single word that I was exactly what I am." "I did know," Alexander said. "I knew the moment your father said you were useless, because I have met the people that word gets applied to, and they are never the ones it describes." Margaret crossed the library. She stood in front of his chair. "Ask me," she said. He stood, close enough to see the gray at his temples, the laugh lines deepening again, the blue eyes holding 6 years of grief and 6 months of hope. "Will you stay? Not as my librarian, not as payment for a debt. As Margaret Lacey, who reads Adam Smith aloud and dances at Christmas assemblies and writes essays that make landowners uncomfortable. Will you stay as the woman I love?" "Yes," she said. "Yes." He took her hands. His were larger than hers, warm, steady. She felt the leather of his notebook pressing against her fingers through his breast pocket, and she thought, "We are both people who carry our important things close to our hearts." They married in April, not at Halford Park, not in London, but at the small parish church in the village, the same village where the Christmas assembly had been held, the same dance floor where Margaret had danced for the first time. She chose it deliberately. She wanted to marry in the place where she had first been, visible. Margaret wore a simple cream dress, and her mother's brass ring, and early wildflowers in her auburn hair. She carried a book instead of a bouquet, a small leather volume of Wordsworth that Alexander had left on her desk in the first week, the first book he had offered, and the only one she had never returned. Alexander wore his charcoal coat and managed to keep his notebook in his pocket through the entire ceremony, which Mrs. Calloway later described as an act of extraordinary restraint, given that the man takes notes during his own breakfast. Louisa came. She had traveled from Briarfield alone, without their father's permission, without telling him. She sat in the front pew in a blue dress and cried. Honest, uncomplicated joy, the joy of a younger sister watching her older sister emerge into something good. She brought a gift, a set of fine candles, expensive ones, the kind that burn long and bright, with a note that said, "So you never have to steal light again." Margaret held the note and pressed her brass ring against her lips and did not try to stop the tears. Louisa reached forward from the pew and squeezed her hand, and between the sisters, in that grip, in that moment, 15 years of shared silence was acknowledged and forgiven and released. Mrs. Harding came too. The cook from Briarfield, who had saved candle stubs for 15 years without being asked, sat in the third pew in her Sunday dress and wept openly and without embarrassment. When Margaret saw her, small, round, fierce Mrs. Harding, who had fed her in secret and kept the faith, Margaret left the altar, walked down the aisle, and embraced her. The congregation watched. The vicar waited. Nobody minded. Sir Roland was not invited. Arabella sent a brief letter of congratulations from the house of the solicitor she had recently married. She did not attend. The vicar asked for her name. "Margaret Lacey," she said, clear, steady, no crack in her voice. And then, "soon to be Margaret Wren." Alexander's vows were not traditional. "I vow to never lock a library door," he said. "I vow to keep paper and ink in every room of this house. I vow to argue with you about Ricardo and lose gracefully. I vow to never read your drafts without asking. I vow to dance with you in libraries when there is no music and in assembly halls when there is. And I vow that no one will ever call you useless again. Not in my house, not in my presence, not in this life." "And I vow," Margaret said, her green eyes bright, "to read aloud every evening, to fill every margin with arguments you haven't considered, to tell you when you are steering instead of supporting, to dance on your toes when necessary, and to never, ever be silent again." Mrs. Calloway, sitting in the second pew, pressed a handkerchief to her eyes and muttered something that sounded like, "About time." That evening in the library at Halford Park, Margaret sat in the armchair by the fire with a new notebook, leather-bound, her initials pressed into the cover, M.R.W. now, Margaret Rose Wren, and she began her second essay. Alexander sat in the opposite chair. He held a book open but was not reading. He was watching her. The way the firelight caught her auburn hair and turned it copper, the way she pressed her brass ring against her lip when thinking, the way her brow furrowed in the pattern that meant someone, somewhere, was about to regret encountering her argument. On the mantelpiece, arranged with care, sat 3 objects: her mother's brass ring, removed for the first time, replaced by a wedding band and given a place of honor; Alexander's leather notebook, its spine worn soft from 6 years of carrying, and a copy of the Agricultural Review, open to an essay by Margaret Lacey. 3 objects, 3 lives, 3 kinds of love, a mother's, a wife's, and a mine's. On the desk by the window, a letter from Louisa, already answered, a second letter from Mrs. Harding, already framed, and a stack of blank cataloguing cards which Margaret had taken to using as bookmarks, each one containing, in her small, precise handwriting, a thought she wanted to remember. "Alexander," she said without looking up. "Yes? Thank you for saying read." He set down his book. He looked at his wife, his librarian, his equal, his challenger, the woman whose father had called her useless and who had proven, in every way that mattered, that she was anything but. "Margaret," he said, and the way he said it, gently, with weight, with the particular tenderness of a man who understands that a name is the most important thing a person possesses, made her look up. She smiled. The real smile, the one that started in her green eyes and rewrote the face entirely, the smile that Mr. Petworth, the dancing master, had seen first, and Mrs. Calloway had seen second, and Alexander saw every day and never tired of, because it was the visible proof that the door Margaret had pressed her ear against for 15 years was finally, permanently, irreversibly open. "Margaret," he said again, because her name was worth repeating, because a name spoken with love is the opposite of a name denied, because every time he said it the word useless lost a little more of its power, until one day, not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but one day soon, it would have no power at all, and Margaret Wren would hear it the way you hear a language you no longer speak, recognizable, but no longer yours. The fire burned low. Rain tapped against the tall windows, and in the library at Halford Park, a woman who had been called useless wrote her second essay in a notebook with her own initials, and the man who loved her did not pretend to stop watching. And outside, the rain fell on a world that was slowly, imperfectly, reluctantly learning that the minds it had silenced were the ones it needed most. And that, my friends, is the story of the woman they called useless, and the Duke who said read, and the library that changed everything. Thank you for being here tonight. Every listen, every comment, every subscription builds this community. And this community is built on the belief that your voice matters, that your mind matters, that the person you are when no one is watching is the person most worth knowing. If this story made you feel something, tell me about it in the comments. Which moment stayed with you? Was it the dinner table when her father said those 3 words to the wrong man? Was it the first time she read aloud, with her voice cracking on the first syllable? The moment she found Catherine's journal? The argument about the draft? When she told a duke he was doing what her father did? The morning she told her father no? Or was it the library when she said, "Ask me," and he finally did? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, join this community. The next story is already taking shape, and I promise you, it will be just as intense. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, you are not useless. You never were. The people who told you that were simply afraid of what you are, and what you are is extraordinary. Good night, my friends. I will see you in the next one.